Hello, and welcome to Vision and Voices, a podcast where ordinary people are doing extraordinary things in your neighborhood. Today, we're trying to talk about a difficult topic. There's a lot going on in our world right now. And our last month, we talked about the coronavirus. We talked about the effects that it's having in our neighborhoods and in our communities and also in our world. And now we're talking about another virus that's going on right now. That virus is racism. We're talking about racism, social justice, or injustice, if you want to call it that. We're talking about police brutality. A lot of different things that people are affected by, people are upset by, people are frustrated by. And just kind of want to touch on those things. I know we can't solve everything right now, but just to talk about what we can do, talk about some of the things that are available to us, the resources that are available to us, and kind of start the discussion. I have two special guests with us today. I'm so excited to have our pastor, Damien Johnson, he's the senior pastor at our Seabrook Seventh-day Adventist Church in Lanham, Maryland. And I also have Reverend Sandra Trice Gray, who is our chaplain of Volunteers of America, Chesapeake and Carolinas. So excited to have you both here with us today. I'm just going to give a little background for both of you. Pastor Johnson, who's a native of Washington, D.C., his roots started with their first Seventh-day Adventist church in Washington. Pastor Johnson graduated from Columbia Union College in Tacoma Park. And he has a Bachelor's of Arts degree in theology and a Master's of Divinity degree from the Seventh-day Adventist Theology Seminary at Andrews University in Berrien Springs, Michigan. Pastor Johnson, one of the things that I noticed in your bio that stood out for me was you said throughout your 27 years in preaching, your aim has always been to convey the clearest terms, the good news of God's relentless love for all humanity and the hope that is found in Christ Jesus. And I think that's something that we need right now. So that's something that's going to resonate with us. I was talking with Reverend Gray earlier about a message that I heard that you preached it's called A Word to Mr. C. And I think it's one of your most recent messages. So I definitely want to touch on that because it's definitely relevant to what we're discussing today. And then let me tell you guys a little bit about Reverend Gray. So Reverend Sandra Trice Gray is the chaplain and an ordained interdenominational minister with Volunteers of America, Chesapeake and Carolinas, as well as the spiritual director and spiritual development resource. Reverend Gray majored in spirituality at St. Mary's Seminary and University of Ecumenical Institute of Theology, which prepared her for ministry focused on pastoral and spiritual care, spiritual direction and growth, as well as facilitating the spiritual formation of others. I want to jump into our topic today. And Reverend Johnson, if you can share a little bit about your message, because I think it's definitely appropriate for what we're talking about. Your message was a word to Mr. C, and you kind of talked about Cain and Abel, and am I my brother's keeper? If you wouldn't mind touching on the topic of what you shared in your message, just a bit for us so we can have a good understanding. One of the things I thought that stood out, and I mentioned this to Reverend Gray, is you talked about if we don't take care of the world that we're living in right now, if we don't, we aren't active in trying to make a change in who's to say that we would benefit from what's in heaven for us? Who's to say that we're fit to benefit from what's there? So if you could share a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think in that part of the message, I was speaking a lot to church folk, and I was speaking to those. There are some in the church who take the mindset that, hey, nothing can really get perfectly right in this world, in this current age. We won't really see pure, perfect justice and equality until the Lord comes and ushers in his kingdom. So what's the use? What's the use of being engaged in the struggle? What's the use of participating in the political process that could bring about change? And the point that I was making is that in the Old Testament scriptures, in Isaiah's writings, Jeremiah's writings, the prophets describe God as being very upset, not only that he doesn't find the justice he's looking for in this world, but that he doesn't find enough people calling for justice.
Hmm.
And so my point was that God is not only looking for justice, he's looking for those who cry out for justice, speak out for justice.
Hmm.
And so therefore, if I'm not engaged in what God is looking for, then it's hard to imagine that I can just float into, the pearly gates and enjoy the benefits of pure justice and equality then. It's just that old principle of if you're not doing the job where you are, how do you expect to get promoted?
I love it. When I listened to the message and I was like, wow, this is so pertinent. This is definitely relevant to what we're dealing with. Reverend Gray, I know that, we in our organization, we've called and, we've done a few different things. We've had a kind of a town hall, so to speak, and prayer meetings where we're discussing it. How does that make you feel that we are being active and we're actively participating in trying to make change in this world?
I'm not so sure it makes me feel anything.
Okay.
What I'm concerned about is our consistency in the message we're delivering to ourselves and to the community. I feel we have an obligation to stress the importance of justice, not just social justice, but justice of all kinds. And when I think about it, I go back to Pope Paul II, and he says that racial justice is a life issue. And I'm not sure we see it that way based on how we treat each other and how we see ourselves in the larger world. I'm concerned, pleased, but concerned that Volunteers of America Chesapeake and the Carolinas are just now acknowledging that Black lives matter. Black lives have always mattered.
Mm-hmm.
All lives have always mattered because we are a Christian church without walls, and we are indeed God's children. And as God's children, we have an obligation to see the world as closely as we can, as God sees us. We're heirs with Christ, joint heirs with Christ. And in him we live and move and have our very being. And we should act that way. We are indeed our brother's keepers. And as our brother's keepers, we've got to speak up, step out, and accept the role that God has given us. Such a huge responsibility. But I'm pleased with Volunteers of America's mission, and that is to help America's most vulnerable to have access and achieve what needs to be achieved so they can live in this society.
Great, I love it. I kind of want to steer us to what's been going on right now. So everyone has viewed the video with George Floyd's death, and, it sparked, a movement, so to speak. Why do you think it was that video, kind of kicked this off? Or was it actually that video? Was it a combination of events that have happened most recently? Pastor Johnson, I'm going to ask that question to you.
I think it was a spark. It was like, the match hitting, the straw. We not too long had seen the video of Ahmaud, and that already kind of had our minds again saying, here we go again. And then to see the brutal and torturous execution, as I would call it, of George Floyd right in our faces in camera. I mean, it was like a real lynching, public lynching. And for people, white and black, who saw that, there was no excuse. There was no kind of euphemizing or diluting of those images that you could find. It was just in your face. He basically died of the same kind of injury you probably would suffer in a hanging. And for us to see that and see not only that, but just kind of the peace that the officer was in as he did that. There was no stress on his face. It was just completely apathetic. I think that was just infuriating for people. If you had any human emotion, you were infuriated and highly disturbed at those images. And I think that just really kind of sparked, again, just the pure unadulterated kind of hate and brutality that we saw there just really stirred up human emotion, okay, that people said, you know, doesn't matter what race I belong to, this is just wrong. This is wrong. And I think it brought front and center what, as Reverend Gray said, what Black people have been saying for the longest time. And, you know, we were met with, well, come on, you all get over that. It's, you know, isolated events. Everybody gets roughed up every now and then. But I think this made people pay attention and realize, folks, this is real. Black people do get profiled. Black people do get targeted by law enforcement. Black people are assumed guilty the moment they are seen, and this is the result. So I think, yes, you know, very recent events kind of primed us for this, but that imagery there, just that was the match that hit the straw.
Reverend Gray, and I'll ask you this question. I mean, most recently we've seen so many videos now are coming out. You know, this kind of led us to say, oh, wait a minute, but here's another one, and here's another instance, just so people, I guess, could see that this is really real, you know, that happens more. This isn't a unique situation, right? But what does that do to us, seeing these videos all the time? I mean, what does that do to our mentality, to, you know, just an everyday individual?
Crystal, this was an attack on the soul of America. I don't know of anyone I've spoken with whose soul was not affected by that incident and all the incidents leading up to that and since then. If you could say the coronavirus did something for us, it made all of us be at home so that we could see it. And if we hadn't seen it, we still would not believe it. It's like a modern day lynching, as Pastor Johnson said. We have evolved to a heart that is, for some people, that is hardened against mercy, against love, against compassion. We have created, or society has fostered, a police force that's about, rather than helping people, and I'm not saying all police are like this, but even a few are too many, that can wreak havoc and terrorize the citizens that they're supposed to be protecting. And that's what we saw when we saw Floyd murdered on TV. It was so horrific. My husband couldn't even watch it. He saw it the first time, and each time it came on again, he had to leave the room. It was so horrifying. But if you think back to the days of the lynchings following slavery and during slavery and since, it's that same horrific feeling, the lynching of Black men. And I heard a woman say not too long ago, she was having her first child and she was just so excited. And then she found out she was having a boy. And of course she was excited that she was having a boy, but then said, I am raising a Black man in a racist society. And how am I going to do that and keep him safe? That's a terrible thought for a brand new mother to have as her child is getting ready to enter this world.
I absolutely agree. I have a 17-year-old son, And as hard as it is, I have to sit him down and allow him to watch what's on the news, and we have to discuss it because, it's real. Unfortunately, he is going to experience incidents because it's going to happen,
That's
so
right.
the only thing I can do at this point is to prepare him, as best as I can, for what it is how you have to respond. Oh my goodness, it hurts you to say that, but how you have to respond in situations and what you need to do,
And the challenge we have today, our children are outspoken.
That's right. That's right. And he's very outspoken. Yes.
And I'm relating to my grandson because my grandson always has an opinion about everything, including the police.
Absolutely. And
I keep trying to warn him how important this is for him to pay attention.
Yes. Oh my goodness.
It's not working. It's just not working. So I just share the information, tell him how to respond when a police officer approaches him and how humble he needs to be and where his hands need to be when in sight of a police officer. But child, I pray every single day he leaves this house.
Absolutely.
Because there's no guarantee that they aren't going to treat him like any other person they think is guilty. Right. The unfortunate part about this society, they view Black men as being scary. Once they reach a certain age, they just assume that they're going to be a big, Black, scary, and forceful person that they have to control first and then talk. It's not fair. It's just, but life, as I tell my grandson, is not fair. But I'd rather have you safe and at home than for you to be out there arguing with a police officer and wind up dead. So this is how you have to behave, whether you want to or not, because these are modern day lynchings, and the lynching has only evolved.
Yeah, unfortunately, and it's just not our sons, it's our daughters as well.
That's right.
Yeah, and I think I expressed to you a couple years ago, my daughter had an incident, at her school. She's away at college, and there was an incident and it was I think it was county police officers that came, and they were closing down a concert because of some issues that were happening outside of the concert. My daughter was actually inside, not aware of what was going on outside, and went to go to the restroom. And the police officer stops her and tells her she needs to leave the building. And she's like, what is going on? I brought my ticket. She's, not understanding why she's being put out. She felt like she was being put out. And he was like, look, I told you to leave. And he throws her on the ground, handcuffs her. Can you imagine my daughter, my baby, and unfortunately they wouldn't even let her use her phone to call. She had her iWatch on. And because she had her iWatch on, she was able to contact me, and I was able to get some help there. But that was the scariest situation ever.
Think about the young people now who love to socialize in the mall, and they are followed by detectives and police officers walking while Black in the mall.
Yeah.
They're searched, detained, until the situation is resolved in the officer's mind. And none of them, to my knowledge, have ever been found with items that have been shoplifted, but they continued to be harassed.
All right, so Pastor Johnson, so with all of the outcry from citizens all over the country, all over the world, do you think we're going to get some police reform? Do you think this is actually going to, cause us to make some change in this country?
Wow, that's a huge question. I'd like to say that I'm optimistic. I feel good about global protests that, are continuing to take place around the world. I feel good that white people are, in some cases, you've seen the video footage. In some cases, in some of these protests, you're seeing more whites than blacks, at these protests. I'm glad there are a lot of our white sisters and brothers who are waking up to this reality and realizing, you know what, we can't be silent. You see the slogans, silence is violence. Some slogans that specifically say silence is white violence, white silence is white violence, and those kinds of things. Where my caution is just, we've had awakenings before. We've had the civil rights era. Before that, we had the Reconstruction era. We've had these kind of awakenings before, and racism is so enmeshed and entangled in our structure. It's going to be beyond a Herculean feat to untangle. It goes beyond police brutality. Police brutality exists because of the racial injustice and prejudice that is so ingrained in our system. And so I think that the protest has to continue, and it has to be followed with action. People have to be engaged. People have to be watching legislation. People have to be calling their representatives. People have to be participating in the election process like never before. Nobody can afford to say, well, my vote doesn't matter, or, well, I can't make it. Everybody's got to participate. And those who love justice and equality have to be aware, not just in the presidential election, but the judges you're voting for on the local level, the sheriffs you're voting for, all of these individuals that you're electing on the local level, state and county and city level, they all matter. They all matter. And so I guess, Crystal, I'm saying that I feel good about the outcry, and I hope it continues until we begin to see some results. I'm just very cautious because we've had these things again. And when we start cooling down, things kind of tend to turn to normal. The other thing that gives me caution is when we've had outcries, there's been change, but racism has this uncanny way of mutating and morphing into something else. So, slavery in one era, and in the next era, that takes on a different look. It takes on a different clothing.
Jim Crow.
Now mass incarceration
right.
Of Black folks.
Right.
You see what I'm saying? So It tends to, if you cut it, it's almost like water finds the path of least resistance. You cut off a path and it somehow finds a way to trickle somewhere else. And that's kind of how I've seen racism take its course, where, okay, we cut off slavery, but it trickles into something. It trickles into Jim Crow, and it trickles into what we have now with criminal injustice. So I don't want to sound doom and gloom, but I just need to see real action. I need to see real change somewhere before I start getting my hopes up.
Part of the challenge is that our society is filled with systemic racism. And because of that systemic racism, what you hear Pastor Johnson describing makes it almost impossible to eradicate it unless everybody cares about it and does something about it. And right now, we only have the advocates working on it, but every member of society has to work on it. And you think about what happened in Central Park with the young lady who called the police on a young man who was bird watching.
Right.
And all he asked her is to follow the rules. Put your dog on a leash. So she decides what she feels she's entitled to is to accuse him of attacking her and calling the police to act on it, realizing the trouble she was getting this young man in. That system, those actions, and she felt right about doing it. We refer to that as systemic racism, and there's no call for it until we can eradicate it. We're going to be in this pot of racist society as long as we're here. But I think each of us has an obligation to do what we can about racism, call people out on it. In fact, we sit at family tables and listen to jokes that are racist, call them out on it, call them out on it in staff meetings, wherever you see or hear it. And until we start regularly calling them out on it, it's not going to change.
I think what Reverend Gray said was so important, that not just at the polls or in groups of protest, but like you said, when you're sitting in that office and you encounter a racist comment, call it out. I mean, it's going to take individuals challenging this attitude at every turn, in board meetings, in staff meetings, in all of that. It's going to take that till people understand this is not tolerable. And Reverend Gray mentioned that Central Park incident. That was a very important incident, because what it was an admission. It was an admission. It was, without her knowing it, it was this white woman admitting that blacks are assumed guilty no matter what. All I need to do is call the police and say a black man is watching me. I will get immediate response, forceful response, and they're going to come crushing down on it. So she was admitting to the world that we have this entitlement and this privilege over black men and women.
And the unfortunate thing is that man could have lost his life, if it had, escalated into something. Yeah, and it's sad, but it's true. We gotta wrap this up, but this is a conversation that I know can go on. And I thank you both for sharing with me today. I thank you, Pastor Johnson and Reverend Sandra Gray. I thank you guys for joining us on this topic that hopefully we'll have more. Hopefully we'll talk more about it. Hopefully we'll be able to, keep engaging individuals, not only in our communities, but also, outside of those communities as well. And again, I thank you guys for joining us on Vision and Voices, a podcast where ordinary people are doing extraordinary things in their neighborhood. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Watch this podcast and others like it on dragondigitalradio.podbean.com. Don't forget to share and also to comment. Thank you again.
Connect with us. We are Dragon Digital Radio.